He left the house on a Tuesday morning at 6:12 a.m. and did not close the gate behind him. Chidinma heard the truck engine turn over twice before it caught, heard the tires roll over the loose gravel on Bourdillon Road, and by the time she reached the window with their 9-month-old daughter on her hip, the tail lights were already 2 houses down. There was no note. There was no suitcase missing from the wardrobe, which was the part that confused her for years afterward, because a man who plans to leave usually takes his shirts. Emeka took nothing. He left his shoes lined up by the door and his cup half full of cold tea on the counter. And he left a wife who would spend the next 3 days telling the neighbors he had gone to Abuja for work. She did not know then that the man behind the wheel already knew he was never coming back, and that the reason had nothing to do with another woman and everything to do with a phone call he had received the night before. Chidinma Okoro was 31 years old that morning and weighed 108 pounds, which was 14 pounds less than she had weighed at her wedding 4 years earlier, because worry does to a body what hunger does. And she had been worried for a long time without letting herself name it. She stood 5'4" in the flat brown sandals she wore every day, the ones with the straps she had restitched twice with fishing line, because a cobbler in Makola Market wanted more to fix them than she could spare. She smelled faintly of shea butter and the powdered milk she mixed for the baby, and her hair was wrapped in a headscarf the color of dried tobacco leaves that had once belonged to her mother. On the 3rd finger of her left hand, she still wore the thin gold band Emeka had bought her, and she would keep wearing it for another 6 months before she finally understood that waiting was not the same thing as loyalty. She had one thing that was entirely hers, and it was a wooden sewing box her grandmother had built in Enugu in 1979 from the door of an old wardrobe. The hinges were brass and the lid did not close flush anymore, and inside it she kept needles, 3 spools of thread, a pair of shears she sharpened on the back step, and a folded square of Ankara cloth she had never cut, because she was saving it for something she could not yet see. Chidinma could sew, not the way women sew to mend a hem, but the way a person sews when their hands were trained young by someone who took it seriously, even stitches, invisible seams, a buttonhole so clean it looked machine-made. Her grandmother used to say a good seam was a promise you made to cloth, and Chidinma had believed that her whole life without ever being paid properly for it. That skill would matter later in a way she could not have imagined the morning her husband drove away. But that morning, all it meant was that she could take in other people's clothing to fix, and that the fixing paid barely enough to keep powdered milk in the tin. Her goal was not complicated. She wanted to keep her daughter fed and to keep the 2 rooms they rented above a hardware shop. And she wanted to do it without asking anyone for anything, because asking was a door she had watched her own mother knock on too many times. So on the morning Emeka left, after she had cried once in the bathroom with the tap running so the baby would not hear, she washed her face, wrapped the child against her back with a length of cloth folded the way her grandmother had taught her, slowly, carefully, the corner tucked under just so, and she went downstairs to open the small window where she took in mending. She did not fall apart. She folded a shirt that a customer had left, pressed the collar flat with her palm, and set it on the shelf. That was the shape of her dignity. It did not shout. It just kept its hands moving. The landlord's name was Mr. Achebe, and he owned the hardware shop below and the 2 rooms above and a 3rd property across the street. And he was not a cruel man in the way that villains are cruel. He was worse than that, because he was reasonable. He wore a clean short-sleeved shirt every day and kept a ledger in a locked drawer and greeted everyone by name. And when the rent came due on the 5th of each month, he expected it in full and on time, because those were the rules, and the rules were the same for everyone, which was exactly the sentence he used when he needed to feel comfortable about something. He had a habit of looking at a person's shoes before he looked at their face. When Chidinma came to him on the 8th of that month, 3 days late, with 340 naira short of what she owed because Emeka had emptied the joint account before he drove away, Mr. Achebe looked at her restitched sandals and then at the baby on her back. And he did not raise his voice. He simply said that he was sorry, but he ran a business, not a charity, and that she had until the end of the week. There were people who saw this happen. The young man who worked the counter in the hardware shop stood in the doorway with a box of screws in his hands and watched the whole exchange. And when Chidinma turned to leave, he stepped back inside and became very interested in the box. A woman selling oranges from a stand across the road saw it too, and she looked away and rearranged her fruit. Nobody was wicked. Everybody just had their own week to survive. And a stranger's trouble is a heavy thing to pick up when your own arms are already full. This is the part that Chidinma remembered most sharply in the years that followed. Not the landlord's words, which were only words, but the sound of the young man stepping back inside, the small scrape of his sandals on the concrete as he chose not to be part of it. She did not give up. That is not what women like Chidinma do. She took the sewing box down from the shelf, and she went to work in a way she had never worked before, taking in more clothing than she could reasonably finish. Sitting up past midnight with a paraffin lamp because the electricity was cut on the 3rd week, her fingers moving over cloth she could barely see. She walked to 4 different shops in Makola Market carrying a bundle of samples, a child's dress she had made from scraps, a man's shirt with a collar turned so clean you would not know it had been repaired. And she asked each of them whether they needed a seamstress. 2 said no. 1 said they already had a woman. The 4th, a fabric seller named Auntie Blessing, who had a stall near the eastern gate, took the child's dress in her hands and turned it inside out and ran her thumb along the seam, and her face changed. But she said she could not pay much, and she could not pay until the end of the month, and Chidinma needed money by Friday. The rain came that Thursday, the way it comes in Accra in June, all at once and without apology. It hit the tin roofs of Makola Market like handfuls of gravel thrown from above, and it turned the lanes between the stalls into brown rivers that pulled at the ankles, and it made the whole market smell of wet cardboard and diesel and the sharp green smell of crushed leaves. Chidinma stood under the narrow overhang of a closed stall with the baby wrapped tight against her chest, under her own wrapper, so that the child stayed dry even as the rain soaked through Chidinma's headscarf and ran down the back of her neck and into her collar. She had 60 naira in her pocket and a bundle of finished mending in a plastic bag she held against her body to keep the water out. She had been standing there for 40 minutes. She was not crying. She was counting the coins in her pocket with her thumb, the same 3 coins, over and over. The way a person counts something not because the number will change, but because the counting is the only thing left to hold. The eviction was set for noon on Friday, and it was already Thursday afternoon, and she was 340 naira short with no way to make it up in a single day. She had walked the length of the market twice that week, from the eastern gate to the poultry sheds and back, counting the stalls that had turned her away. And the count did not improve for being repeated. Her sandals had come apart again at the left strap, and she had knotted it with a length of the same fishing line she used to mend cloth, and the knot rubbed a raw place into the side of her foot with every step, so that by the 2nd hour, she was walking with a small hitch she tried to hide. Water dripped from the overhang above her in a steady line that had found the exact gap between her headscarf and her collar, and each drop traced the same cold path down her spine. And she did not move out of its way, because there was nowhere drier to stand and because moving felt like more effort than she had left. The baby stirred against her chest, made one small complaint, and settled again, warm and dry under the wrapper. And Chidinma pressed her palm flat against the small back through the cloth, then held it there until the child slept. It was Auntie Blessing who found her there. The older woman came splashing down the lane under a black umbrella with a hole in it, saw Chidinma standing under the overhang with the shape of the child moving beneath her wrapper, and she stopped. She did not say anything sympathetic. She just tilted the umbrella so it covered them both, took the wet plastic bag out of Chidinma's hands without asking, and said, "Come. You will catch cold standing here, and the child will catch it from you." She brought Chidinma back to her stall and sat her on a low stool behind the fabric bolts where it was dry. And she poured hot ginger tea from a flask into the cup of the flask itself and pressed it into Chidinma's cold hands. And she said one more thing before she went back to serving customers. She looked at the sewing box that Chidinma had carried through the rain, still dry inside its second plastic bag, protected more carefully than Chidinma had protected herself. And she said, "A woman who keeps her tools dry in a flood is a woman who has not given up. Whatever you are running from, it has not caught you yet." What Chidinma did not know was that Auntie Blessing had noticed something else. She had turned that child's dress inside out 3 days earlier and seen a particular stitch along the shoulder seam, a locked cross-stitch worked by hand that almost nobody used anymore, because it took 4 times as long as a straight seam. She had seen that stitch exactly once before in her life, on garments that came into a shop she had worked in as a girl 50 years ago, a shop that dressed the wives of men whose names were painted on the sides of buildings. She said nothing about it that day. But that night, after she had locked her stall, Auntie Blessing made a phone call to a number she had not dialed in 11 years. For 3 days after that, things seemed to turn. Auntie Blessing gave Chidinma a corner of her stall and a stack of garments to alter, and paid her a small advance out of her own purse, enough to bring the rent almost current, enough that Mr. Achebe agreed to wait until the following Friday. Chidinma began to breathe again. She let herself imagine a version of the coming months that did not end in the street. And then, on the 4th day, a lawyer came to the market looking for her. He was a thin man of about 60 in a gray suit that had gotten wet at the shoulders, and he wore glasses that he took off and wiped on a handkerchief before he spoke, a small habit that gave him a moment to arrange difficult words. He carried a leather folder worn pale at the corners, and he asked for her by her full name, Chidinma Okoro, wife of Emeka Okoro. And when she said yes, that was her, his face did something complicated. He told her, standing there in the noise of the market with the baby fussing on her back, that her husband Emeka had died 19 days ago in Abuja. His truck had gone off the Kubwa Expressway in heavy rain, and he had lived for 2 days in a hospital. And in those 2 days, he had done one thing. He had signed a document. The lawyer had spent 2.5 weeks trying to find her, because Emeka had not left an address, only a name and the word Makola. Chidinma sat down on Auntie Blessing's low stool very slowly and did not speak for a long time. She had spent months being angry at a man for leaving her, and now she had to fold that anger back up and put it somewhere, because the story she had been telling herself was the wrong story, and she did not yet know what the right one was. It was Auntie Blessing who understood before Chidinma did. She had been standing close enough to hear the lawyer say the name of the hospital and the name of the road. And she made a sound low in her throat and put her hand on Chidinma's shoulder. Then she asked the lawyer the question that Chidinma was too stunned to ask. She asked what the document said, and the lawyer opened his leather folder and took out a single sheet of paper and what he read from it changed the direction of everything that followed. Emeka Okoro, it turned out, had not been a driver of an old truck. Or rather, he had been that. But only because he had spent 11 years hiding from a family that had cast him out. The phone call he had received the night before he drove away had been from a lawyer telling him that his father, a man named Chief Daniel Okoro, who owned a textile manufacturing company in Aba with 400 employees and contracts across 3 countries, was dying and had asked to see the son he had disowned. Emeka had driven toward Abuja not to abandon his wife, but to reach his dying father before it was too late. And he had told no one because he was ashamed of the family that had thrown him out at 20 for marrying beneath them the first time, ashamed that he had never told Chidinma the truth about where he came from, ashamed that he had let her believe for 4 years that they were poor, because that was easier than explaining that he had chosen this life, to spite a father who had never once written to him. He had reconciled with the old man for exactly 1 afternoon before the road took him, and in the hospital, dying, with his father's lawyer at the bedside, Emeka had signed his inheritance not to himself, because he knew he would not live to use it, but to his wife and daughter. The company, the house in Aba, the shares, all of it, to a woman who at that moment was standing under a market overhang counting 3 coins in the rain. The document was contested, of course. That was the false floor beneath the false floor. Emeka's uncles, who had run the company in the years the old man was ill, did not intend to hand 400 employees and 3 international contracts to a seamstress from Makola Market whom none of them had ever met. And they had their own lawyers, and those lawyers were expensive and fast. For a while, it looked as though the paper the thin man had read in the rain was going to be worth nothing at all. That Chidinma would spend what little she had fighting people who had more, and lose. She very nearly signed a settlement that would have given her a small sum to go away quietly, the same shape, she noticed later, as the way her husband had once been asked to go away quietly, the family's oldest instinct, to make an inconvenient person disappear with money. But Auntie Blessing had made a phone call 11 days before the lawyer ever arrived. And the person she had called was an old woman named Nana Efua, 78 years old, who had once been the head of the sewing floor at Okoro Textiles for 31 years before she retired, and who remembered a particular locked cross-stitch that the founder's own mother had taught to her seamstresses as a signature no factory could copy. Auntie Blessing had known Nana Efua as a girl before either of them had gray in their hair, and she had not spoken to her in 11 years. Not since a falling out over money that neither of them could quite remember the details of anymore. But some things are larger than an old quarrel. So on the night she first turned that child's dress inside out and felt her stomach drop at what she saw along the shoulder seam, Auntie Blessing sat in the dark of her locked stall and dialed a number from memory. And when the old woman answered on the 4th ring, sounding suspicious and half asleep, Auntie Blessing did not apologize and did not explain the 11 years. She said only, "Efua, I have found the stitch, the real one, on a child's dress sewn by a girl who does not know what she has." And there was a long silence on the line, and then the sound of an old woman sitting up in her bed. Nana Efua had come to Makola Market herself, an old woman moving slowly with a cane, and she had asked to see the child's dress, and she had turned it inside out with hands that looked like they had never once stopped working. And she had gone very still, because the stitch on that seam was not just similar to the Okoro signature stitch. It was the stitch, worked correctly, the way it had not been worked in the factory itself for over a decade, because the woman who taught it was gone, and the young ones did it faster and wrong. Chidinma had learned it from her grandmother in Enugu, and her grandmother had learned it in a shop in Aba in 1961, a shop owned by the mother of a man named Daniel Okoro. Nana Efua, arrived at the arbitration on a Thursday morning. She did not come to speak on behalf of Chidinma's marriage or her grief, because those were not things a court cared about. She came carrying a garment, a christening gown that Chief Daniel Okoro's own mother had sewn 70 years earlier, kept folded in tissue in a trunk on the factory floor as a relic. And she laid it on the table beside a dress that Chidinma had made 3 weeks before out of scraps. And she asked the uncle's expensive lawyers to find the difference in the seams. There was no difference. The room, which had been full of confident men in good suits, went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something that was supposed to be about money turns out to be about something that cannot be bought. The senior arbitrator, a woman who had said almost nothing for 2 days, leaned forward and looked at the two garments for a long time. Then she looked at Chidinma, sitting straight in her mother's tobacco-colored headscarf with her sleeping daughter against her chest. And she asked her one question. She asked who had taught her the stitch. And Chidinma said, "My grandmother, in Enugu, she told me it was a promise you make to cloth." And the arbitrator wrote something down and set down her pen. And that was the moment the room shifted. The uncles did not go to prison because they had broken no law that a court could name. They had only tried to keep what they believed was theirs, the way men do. But the settlement they had offered Chidinma was withdrawn from the table by the arbitrator herself, who ruled that the signed document was valid and that the woman who could reproduce the founding family's own signature stitch by hand, taught in an unbroken line from the company's origin, was not a stranger to that company, but its truest inheritor. Chidinma Okoro received the house in Aba, a controlling share in Okoro Textiles, and the 400 employees whose livelihoods she now held. She kept Nana Ifua on, not as a relic, but as the head of a new training floor. And the first thing she did with the company was reopen the hand-finishing department that the uncles had closed as unprofitable. And she hired 30 seamstresses out of Makola Market, and she paid them properly, and she paid them on time. Mr. Achebe, the landlord, read about it in the newspaper. He was still a reasonable man. He simply had one fewer tenant, and a small confusion he never fully resolved about the woman whose shoes he had once looked at before her face. Amika thought he was driving away from a life of shame that morning, saying nothing, closing no gate behind him. He believed to the end that he had failed his wife, that he had given her 4 years of poverty, and then died on a wet road before he could explain any of it. But the truth is that he had left her the two things his family had spent 11 years trying to take from him, and neither of them could be signed away or contested by any lawyer. He left her his father's forgiveness, arriving one afternoon too late for him, but exactly in time for her. And he had, without ever knowing it, married a woman whose own hands already carried the family's oldest secret, stitched into her by a grandmother in Enugu who never knew what she was passing down. You can leave a person without saying goodbye. You can drive away in the dark and let them believe the worst of you. And you can even die before the truth catches up. But you cannot control what a person is already carrying in their hands, and you cannot decide, from behind the wheel of a truck on a rainy road, which of the things you leave behind will turn out to be the one that saves them. Some inheritances are not written on paper at all. They are worked into cloth and taught across generations, and they wait quietly in a wooden box carried carefully through a flood, until the day the world finally turns them over and reads what was stitched there all along. 20 years later, a magazine ran a feature on the 10 most influential women in West African manufacturing, and Chidinma Okoro was on the cover, in a dress she had sewn herself, standing on the floor of a factory that employed nearly 900 people. And in a small apartment above a hardware shop, an old man named Achebe, long retired, turned the pages of that magazine at his kitchen table, stopped at the cover, and sat very still for a long time, looking at a face he had once decided he already understood. If someone left your life without a word, and you spent years believing they had abandoned you, only to discover much later that they had been trying to reach you the whole time, would you be able to forgive the silence? And if the thing that finally lifted you up turned out to be a small skill you were never paid for and never thought mattered, would you have kept practicing it through all the years no one was watching? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. And if this story reached you, subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.